Alrighty, welcome back to, as you can see, another tier list. I'm here with Samuel again.
Hi everyone.
And today we're having a bit of a different look on Duel Commander tier lists. From the previous session that we did regarding the best Duel commanders, or the top 20 Duel commanders, many people ask us to do have a look at monocolored decks and monocolored commanders, and I can get behind it because from two perspectives. First, if you're starting with Duel Commander, I think these monocolored tier lists are of great interest for you.
Yep.
Since they're mostly budget friendly. There are some exceptions if we look at the blue pool or if we look at the white pool. You have to include a couple of expensive cards for sure, but most of the time you don't need to play fetch lands and yeah, dual lands and whatsoever. The land base is in many cases the price defining limit. So that's why we thought about having a new series with all the colors and 5 commanders each time. You should find all of those commanders in a given time span on MTG Top 8. Today we're starting with the color red. It is, I would say, the currently least represented color on MTG Top 8 or in a tournament environment. I guess the go-to back then was always Zurgo, being the helm of many red decks. These
And
days,
Karizev and
very back then it was Zurgo, then Zurgo was banned, and then we had an era of 2-drops with Karizev, with Feldon, and other things, These days, I would say the power developed also in a red fashion, but not to the same degree um, in comparison to all the other colors. Like red was not pushed equally. We have Screaming Nemesis and Spider-Punk and things like this, and Hexing Squelcher, all great cards, but it's not enough to support the mono red.
exactly. Yeah, I think I would say the key thing is we have like the good cards that have been printed in red are at their best when combined with other colors.
Yep.
Like a Broadside Bombardiers is a incredible card. It's pretty good in the mono red deck, but if you compare it to a deck that can, like a Slimefoot deck that has the ability to throw a Metamorphosis Fanatic for 8 damage, or these sorts of lines where, you have some mana ramp to go along with the Broadside Bombardiers, then suddenly you're throwing much bigger things than you would be um in just the standard mono red shell. And I think what we are seeing is that the mono red shells just can't really keep up with the synergies that you get to develop between colors. White and red
Yeah.
combine very well together. Like a Flage is just the antithesis to a mono red deck, and you don't really get anything in red to really counter that. And because we have very little non-basic land hate in the format, the payoff to being a mono red deck is not as high as it would be. There's no Price of Progress, there's no Blood Moon anymore, so yeah, it's pretty thin on what you can do on the advantages you gain from those from being monocolored, and mana bases are good enough that at least 2 color usually just makes a better deck.
Yeah, very true. And also, while most other decks have relevant access to the graveyard as a second hand with multiple abilities, that's not the case for red decks mostly. And that's also like a big problem. And at the same time, it does not account to all of those 5 commanders. Magda is an exception here, but at the same time, the red color is rather bad at interacting with the opponent's graveyard. So a
Yep.
classic Zurgo burn red win strategy has very little to offer in terms of interacting with your graveyard, and thereby it's free card advantage for your opponent. If you think about let's say the matchup against Asmo, where Asmo is discarding things and things come back from the graveyard, Red Deck Wins can't do shit against that. So it's definitely a problem for the color. Nonetheless, we've chosen those 5 cards. Today we will do it a bit different in comparison to the last time. Last time we had an individual ranking. So Samuel and me, each of us were assigning tiers on our own. This time we will figure it out together. Starting with Urabrask, which is a card that we had on the channel, I think 2 years ago. Back then, when the card was more or less released, I was experimenting a lot with it, going in a combo-ish big red direction.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, I tried a list as well.
true. You also played it, right?
I
Right.
would say to play mono red storm, um, probably the best commander.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. Or
and
maybe
you know,
is it? Yeah, maybe there's Birgi also, but Birgi doesn't really see much play, to be honest, right?
no, and this card, it presents its own win condition in its kind of storm,
True.
um, in the storm lines that it has, and the the upside that you get from it once it's resolved, and if you start to get to start doing stuff, is much higher than the Birgi, because if a Birgi is in your command zone, she's either in play and then she's a boltable 3-drop, or if you get the Horn, then you don't have the upside of what Urabrask brings you. And Urabrask gives you the ability to, like, Past in Flames in once the Zaga flips back, which is usually difficult to interact with. So if you manage to flip him either the turn he comes down or the turn afterwards, then you're doing pretty well. I think the matchups where you live long enough and are not interacted as much with for you to be able to resolve the Urabrask are few and far between. And that would be, to me, what puts this deck in a little bit of a worse tier, because the deck just doesn't really do much when the commander's not in play. Mm. So one more thing to note, I don't think we've talked about it yet, but this is the rating that we're doing now is within mono red decks.
Exactly.
So not within the format, because we all know if we put something in S tier here, it's not going to be an S tier in the format.
Exactly.
There are very few decks that get to make it to that power level, and I don't think any mono red deck made it onto our top 20 um, in the
Tier list.
format
Yeah.
tier list. So yeah, there's no way anything here that we put in S tier here gets to get as yeah, is an S tier deck. But yeah, I would say Urabrask I would put it between B and C tier. I
Yeah.
don't think it's horrible.
Yeah. I would
Um,
I would personally put it in C tier, I think. For all the things that you mentioned, we have to note that there's like a very small group of passionate players regarding that deck, and you see a couple of results every now and then, but rather rarely. I think the deck has potential. The problem here is definitely that it's very commander centric, as all the storm decks usually are. They need some centerpieces in order to go off, and Urabrask is that centerpiece because it provides the additional mana for casting the spells. And yeah, if your opponent has a simple counter spell and can delay your commander casts, then most of the time it looks bad. Of course, there is a certain percentage of red mid-range cards or value cards that all the decks play. And in some cases, this can rescue you, but most of the time, it I think it just comes down to casting Urabrask, and if you fail to do that, or if you also can't assemble your pieces in a short amount of time, because we know that the format is extremely fast, and many decks can kill on turn 3, turn 4, whatsoever. Um, then I think you just fall behind quite quickly. So I would place it here. I think it's not good enough for B tier. I think C tier is fine in my opinion. I think the B tier slot is saved for another card from those
yeah,
5.
yeah. All
Okay.
right, next card. We have Magda Brazen Outlaw.
Yeah.
Um, I think she a lot of the people that play this deck, probably play her in CDH
Mhm.
and decided, okay, well, if I play it in CDH, I might be able to play it in Duel Commander. I think there's some fun lines to go along with playing it in Duel Commander. There is there's some infinite combos where if you have an artifact creature that is a dwarf, you can make infinite treasures with a clock of omens,
Yeah.
which you can also tutor with her ability. So kind of that loop comes together and just wins you the game if you manage to get there. Um, Aside from that, I think this deck is so commander reliant,
Yeah.
and your commander is a 2/1 without much protection. You don't have the black ability to interact with the opponent's hand, Thoughtseize a removal spell, and kind of have that info. You don't have counter spells to protect your commander. You don't have the green protection spells for your commander, and you don't have the white protection or flicker spells. So, like, ever untapping with your commander, if that happens, you are very late in the game, and maybe you get there because you get to make like cast her 3 or 4 times in a game because of all the treasures you're producing.
Mhm.
But I think the combination of that with, like, having 10 cards in the deck that just do nothing at all, the Dwarven 1/1s, they have basically 0 text on them. So this kind of combination, you are doing cool stuff if you get to go off, and you can do that pretty quickly as well. But I think any deck in Duel Commander has the ability to interact with what you're doing. Maybe outside of like a Lumra or something. Um, then again, Lumra can do stuff very quickly.
Yeah.
So like I feel like the clock on the Magda decks is not like
It's
turn
not
3
great.
on average. I don't think that
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So
I mean, you have to take into account that it's not only that it's super commander reliant. It's also because it's that commander reliant. You have to feature all those dwarfs that, as you said, do absolutely nothing. So going for the tribal route here is basically not irrelevant, but useless in comparison to the goblins, for example, because the dwarves don't really add any value to the game state apart from being dwarves, and they will create treasures once they're tapped. And then apart from the dwarves, you also have to play all these vehicles and springleaf drums and blah 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 and all these effects in order to tap the dwarves, right? Because of course it can go for combat all the time, but most of the time, if you have a 1/1 dwarf and your opponent has an Oslo Pride, then you don't necessarily want to sacrifice your dwarf
yep,
just to get one treasure and trade it with the Oslo Pride. That's usually not what you want to do. So that comes on top. If you have Magda on field and you have these things assembled, then as you said, you can do stuff very quickly and it can end up winning the game. But if not, you're not left with the good red cards that the red card pool has to offer. No, you're left with plenty of cards that only work in combination with Magda, and they do very little outside of that.
yep.
So, saying all that, amongst those five, for me, it's very much the D tier here.
I would say so as well. As yeah, exactly as we just said, the pool just you will have some strong turns,
Hmm.
but the amount of turns that you get that are strong are few and far between, and you just aren't following. You are so focused in on your game plan that anything disrupting that game plan will stop you from playing the game, and then suddenly, yeah, it's just not going to work.
Definitely. Okay. You saw that I swapped the places here quickly because I didn't want to talk about two Magdas
Mhm.
um, in a row. So let's talk about the classic one. I will have to add, it's not only about Zurgo. We also have Kellen and Norin that we did not include here because those cards are interchangeable. I know that there are like some personal preferations. I think some people even prefer to play Kellen because of the card advantage aspect. And whenever, you see especially commander options in the format that have one power and a bit of a higher toughness, as we saw with Thrasios, for example. During the time at which Thrasios was played, Zurgo was definitely the better choice, simply because Thrasios would kill Kellen in one attack, and you can't make use of your commander at all. While Zurgo gives you the ability to swing in, and if you have like additional creatures on board, then the blocking math doesn't look too bad. So we will trade them as the same category, just generic 1 mana legendary to play for mostly the burn strategy, the classic one that we know. I would say amongst the red cards, this is still the one that we see relatively often. Not too often because it doesn't do very well in the current format. We have Tazigor, which provides a 4/5 body very early in the game. That's hard to get rid of. With counter
Yep.
backup, with interaction whatsoever. We have Spider-Man. Spider-Man is basically doing what Red ever wanted to do in a very good fashion. And then we have all the other decks. Then there are cloud decks, failure decks. White has a very good card pool against Red. Also, a very, very good game plan against Red after all. There's Sanctifier. Burnt and Forge Tender is played much more often, rather to defeat or to have an out against Spider-Man, but it also helps against Red deck wins, of course. And Lumra is much faster than an average Zergo. So right now, it doesn't look too good. Nonetheless, to me, again, amongst these five, I would personally still put these decks in A tier. Since, as I said, like the card pool is good for what Red can play, and you do see some results every now and then.
Yeah. I think I'm with you there. I think um I don't know if it was the how do I say this? If it was the general power level of the format that kept the red decks in the format for as long as they were. But we had a string of printings of 1 mana commanders, and after those, I feel like the playability of those decks has dropped significantly.
Yeah,
And I think that's kind of more of a coincidence where we have just a lot of cards in the format that that are good against red deck and that have been printed recently, and so now we're looking at a format which just is much better against red decks in general. And to combine with that, the red decks have also gotten much better because the ability, we talked about this in the past quite a lot, and that was one of the reasons why we were against unbanning Zurgo for a while, because it was scary what the red card pool would do when it had a 1-drop in the command zone and had the ability to cut the 1-drops, get ahead on board in the turn 1 of the game always, and then play many more 2-drops and many more burn spells to account for the missing 1-drops.
yeah,
And, I feel like that is that's still an interesting kind of deck building thing that happens, but just the power level hasn't kept up with the format.
exactly. And also, you have to keep in mind, we have this turn one good creature check already with Yoshi being in the format for quite some time,
Yeah.
which is definitely the better one drop here. I think the dark side we all lived through was when Ragavan was legal. That was definitely a scary red commander. You have to have the turn one removal check, otherwise, your opponent runs away with additional mana and stuff. And we all know what additional mana does in this format, so that was definitely too much. Some people argue that it could be released in the command zone these days. Others want to see it in the 99. That's for another day. we have Zurgo or Helen for now. And as you said, it's just not too scary. And also, as we said plenty of times, the main problem that this strategy has is that there is a bunch of incidental life gain printed on several cards, and that just hurts the entire strategy a lot. You have the Flage, for example. Like Yoshi is a matchup that by default could be interesting against red deck wins, but you can just swap to Flage in the second game, and then you have to fight 1 or 2 lightning helixes a game, and have to like suddenly have to deal 6 damage more, while also taking into account that you lose 2 creatures most likely for that. So yeah, those are all things that red deck wins has to tackle, and it's rough currently. I would say it's very rough. We need more screaming nemesis for this. What is the plural of nemesis? Nemesis, whatever.
Nemesis? I
Let's
don't know. Yeah.
nemesis, yeah. Let's move on with Magda, the crime committing Hoardmaster, I think she was called. Magda the Hoardmaster, right? Um, a card that I played in a member focus session some time ago, last year in Strasbourg. I enjoyed the deck quite a lot. Mm, Back then, I also played it on MTGO, and I was doing quite good with it. Was very much convinced. I haven't. Oh, I played it when people began, or still played it when people began to play Spider-Man, and the Spider-Man matchup was not as bad as you would think, but it was problematic. I personally always thought that Aragon was the worst matchup, unless you tech specific cards against the matchup because of the lifelink aspect. Yeah, you have to spend lots of resources to bring your opponent to certain points of life, and then Aragon resolves, sticks to the board, and they will just gain back. Um,
Yeah.
and you've done so much to get there, because
Absolutely.
committing the crimes, gathering the tokens, and until you can finally make a dragon is costly, or it takes time. Nonetheless, in my opinion, amongst those 5, I would put it in S tier. I think it's when you want to go for red deck right now, I think this is your go-to because it has the most versatile and flexible game plan there is. You have the entire package due to the crime ability. You have the graveyard hate package. You also have a land destruction package. You play ruination. You play tech edge, dust bowl, things like this, tackling matchups from different perspectives. Which also gives you an edge in lands matchups, for example, right? Because red deck wins is usually something that would fold to Maze of Ivs and Glacial Chasms and stuff like this. But here you have a couple of outs. And I really like the flavor of it. Go wide. Personally, I think Quintorius is the better version now available with an additional color. And
Yeah.
overall, like the way the deck is structured and what it can achieve. It's a big upgrade to Magda, but if we stick to the red color, then I would say go for Magda. What do you think?
Interesting. I mean, I played against you playing the deck, quite a bit. I feel like it like, no offense, but I feel like it was never too scary.
But you never won
Um,
either, so no, just kidding. I
did
I,
I?
th- I, th- I think I got along quite well with it against you. Yeah, at
I mean, I
least
was
this
yeah, sure,
session.
I was playing a Terra Reanimator deck, and you had a deck with a million cards of main deck
Yeah,
graveyard hate.
yeah,
That
yeah, yeah. That's
might have been
fair.
the reason. But yeah, I feel like I I guess in the kind of S tier, in the kind of red pool, it's probably one of the better decks. I feel like the Goblin deck is also up there.
Okay,
Um,
interesting.
but that might just be kind of my subjective thinking of I feel like I played a little bit of Goblins in pre-modern, and that might just be kind of how I feel about the deck. I feel like there's always most of the time that I've seen Goblins in Duel Commander, it's by being played by players that usually know their stuff, and th there's, like, there's good reason to be a little bit intimidated, but maybe that's just kind of the way that I perceive the deck as it's being played. I haven't played against it much. I think you played it a little bit,
Muxus,
or
you
did
mean?
you? Yeah, not Muxus. The uh, Rakdos Goblin pile.
Ah, yeah, Grenzo. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you
I
played
did,
that
I
a
did.
little bit at some point.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, maybe I don't think it fits. I think it's probably A tier at least. Do you
Okay.
think it's B tier?
Yeah. What are you talking about? Grenzo?
Uh, no, Muxus.
Muxus. Okay. We arrived at Muxus already. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. For Muxus, I would have placed it like exactly like that.
Huh?
Placed it in B tier because I think the upsides of the deck are, as I said, in comparison to the dwarf card pool, the goblin card pool itself, outside of Muxus, is already good. You have great synergies, boosting your board, getting a couple of other abilities, creating treasure tokens, etc., etc. So that's that. And then also, this you never know if you're a deck that does not feature counter magic. You never know when Muxus comes down. The way the deck is built is you need to get if possible, a couple of goblins on field in order to make use of the trigger. But then you also include all these Jeska's Wills, Geosurges, Seething Songs, whatsoever, right? In order to bring it down as soon as possible. And depending on the variation, sometimes you have like very good hits, and sometimes you don't. Mm, but the random aspect, I think we cast a match from the previous fact, if you remember that, where someone was like playing Muxus. I think against the white deck, I'm not entirely sure. Oh no, it was against Slimefoot actually. And the player was super unlucky with not finding anything amongst the 6 cards a couple of times.
Yeah.
So those situations feel a bit awkward where you play so many cards in order to play your commander, and you finally got there, and then the variation betrays you. That's just something that the other decks on top of that don't really have. And I'm not sure if that again depends on your mulligan, if the goblin quality in the 99 can always compensate for that. I think it sometimes can, depending on setup, but not always. And that's why I would put it here. I think because regarding consistency, Zurgo and Magda are definitely up there. But in terms of what is a better combo deck, it's definitely better than Magda and Urabrask. And that's why I place it in the middle, exactly there. That would be my personal placement. But I can also see putting this on A tier here, to be honest. So
Yeah.
something in between that, I would say, is a fair estimation.
Yeah, I think my thinking would just be that the Goblin pool has the ability to pull off some really strong lines.
Definitely.
Um,
I mean, you also have
most
combos in the 99 too, right? You
Yeah,
have
and,
how's it
like, most
called?
of the
The
time, they
Snoop combo and stuff like this. Yeah.
probably involve, like, basically a Goblin War Chief always, but, yeah, like, for example, there are situations where you're playing against the Goblin deck, and you've kept a little bit of a slowish hand because you're like, "Okay, I'll play a board wipe or something," and then they have a Goblin Lackey turn 1, and you don't have interaction for it turn 1, and then they get to Lackey in some crazy card the next turn and kill you in 2 or 3 turns. And, these sorts of lines exist. I think it's and also if you combine it with cards, you have this is one of the rare decks where you get something um, like an Urza's Incubator that really does work, and you get to commit so hard to the Goblin tribal part of the whole thing that, yeah, maybe there are just really strong lines in the deck. I think, but maybe I'm also just a bit naive in that sense, where I think where I put the deck in my mind higher than it would be the because I haven't seen it play out against as much of the field.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also not entirely sure how the current Goblin 99 looks like. we all witness that set by set there are a couple new additions that are included in either or. There's obviously not the only one goblin deck. There are several things, but Muxus I think is the most represented, I would say. So
Yeah.
yeah, something in between A or B. Nonetheless, I think this setting here is fair, is fine. I would be curious to hear what you guys think. Maybe we have like a very passionate dwarf Muxus player that disagrees with whatever we say here and say, well, the deck is much better than you think, or maybe even Urabrask, or maybe you would say Zurgo is definitely worse. That definitely depends on your personal experience. And Samuel and me, we have played 3 of the 5 decks here. I've touched Muxus briefly, but I wouldn't say I have enough experience to evaluate the deck completely.
Yeah.
But none of us have played Magda. I've played against it on MTGO a couple of times, which, yeah, from seeing the deck, you can estimate quite quickly what's going on, you
Yeah.
know. But we might be wrong here, as is always the case. We can't be 100% precise. But yeah, I hope whether you're a beginner with Duel Commander or a seasoned player who looks to explore monocolors, I hope this was a good session for you. I hope it was insightful and maybe helped you make a decision for your next deck. And if not, maybe we entertained you in the last 30 minutes watching us debating about some red commanders and Duel Commander.
Yeah.
That being said,
Thanks for watching.
and see you next time.
See
Bye
you
bye.
next time.